Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 38, was conducting a routine SAVANNA patrol when she heard the sound that stopped her cold. A cry. Not the roar of a healthy predator, but something desperate and fragile echoing across the grassland. She raised her hand to signal her team to stop. The vehicles behind her halted immediately. In her 12 years as a wildlife conservation officer, Sarah had learned to recognize the difference between animal calls. This one conveyed something that transcended species: abandonment. "Do you hear that?" her colleague James whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She was already moving, her boots pressing into the dusty earth as she followed the sound toward a cluster of rocks. The morning heat was already climbing. The sky above was a pale blue, stretched thin over endless golden grassland. Birds scattered at their approach. The cry came again, weaker this time. Sarah quickened her pace, climbing over a rocky outcrop. Her heart was beating faster than it should. She had learned in her training that desperate animal sounds often meant human intervention was necessary. But wildlife protocol was clear. You observed, you documented, you did not interfere unless life was immediately threatened. She crested the ridge. In the shadow of a large boulder, a lion cub lay alone, completely alone, perhaps 3 months old, with a still fuzzy mane and fur still showing the rosette patterns of early life. The cub's body was thin, visibly thin. Its ribs were prominent beneath, fur that should have been full and healthy. The cub's eyes lifted toward her, and Sarah felt something break in her chest. Those eyes held no wildness, they held only fear and a desperate, fragile hope that this approaching creature might offer something: food, warmth, protection, maternal comfort. "Where is your mother?" Sarah whispered. 6 months earlier, this cub had been born into a pride of 12 lions. The birth had been celebrated by the family, a new male heir to the bloodline, destined to eventually challenge for territory and dominance. His mother was a strong female in her prime, protective and capable. His father, the pride's dominant male, had roared his approval when the cub was first presented, a sound that echoed across the savannah. For 3 months, life had been perfect. The cub played with other young lions, tumbling and wrestling in the golden grass. His mother nursed him regularly, her protective stance never wavering. The pride moved as a unit through their territory, and the cub learned the rhythms of lion life, the stalking, the hunting, the resting in the heat of the day, the vocalizations that bonded the family together. One afternoon, while the pride was resting beneath acacia trees, the cub's mother stood abruptly. Something had changed in her body. A sudden fever gripped her. Her breathing became labored. She tried to continue her maternal duties, but her strength was failing rapidly. A parasitic infection had entered her bloodstream. It spread quickly. Within hours, the once powerful lioness could barely stand. By the next morning, she was dead. The cub had tried to nurse from her body for an entire day before accepting the reality. His mother was gone. The pride, in the way of wild animals, had moved on. There was no time for grief. There was only survival. For 3 days, the cub had been left behind. Not deliberately, not through cruelty, through the simple, brutal calculus of survival. A young cub without a nursing mother could not keep up with the pride's movements. The pride could not stop and wait. The territory had to be defended, food had to be found, the social hierarchy had to be maintained. The cub was a liability. The other females had occasionally returned to check on him. But without a mother's milk, the cub was dying, slowly but inevitably. By the time Sarah found him, he had not eaten in 2 days. His crying had become weaker with each hour. His eyes were starting to glaze. His body temperature was dropping. He was approaching the point where even food and water would not save him. Sarah radioed immediately for veterinary support and transport. This cub was in critical condition. The next few hours would determine everything. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, 45, arrived within an hour. She was the lead veterinarian for the Regional Wildlife Authority, with 20 years of experience in the field. She examined the cub carefully, her weathered hands gentle, despite the urgency of the situation. "Severe malnutrition," she said quietly. "Dehydration. Possible respiratory infection developing. This cub has been alone for approximately 3 days." "Can we save him?" Sarah asked. Elena met her eyes. "We can try, but you need to understand something. This cub's mother is dead, and the pride has abandoned him. Even if we save his life, his future in the wild is uncertain. Lions are social creatures. A solitary cub cannot hunt, cannot defend himself, cannot integrate back into a pride that has already rejected him." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked. "We save his life," Elena said, "and then we figure out what comes next." The cub was transported to the Regional Wildlife Center, a facility designed for emergency animal care. Elena administered intravenous fluids, antibiotics, and supportive nutrition. She created a warm, quiet space where the cub could rest without stress. For 3 days, the cub hovered between life and death. Sarah visited him constantly. She sat beside his enclosure, speaking softly, maintaining a presence that seemed to calm the young animal. The cub's eyes began to focus again. His breathing steadied. His small body began to retain heat. By the 4th day, he was drinking water on his own. By the 5th day, he was eating soft meat that Elena offered. By the 6th day, he was standing, though shakily. But something had changed in the cub that even Elena's medical expertise could not address. The trauma of abandonment had marked him. He moved through his recovery with a weariness that belied his age. He did not play, he did not vocalize much. He simply existed, eating, drinking, sleeping, as if going through the motions of survival rather than living. Sarah began to research the possibilities. Returning him to the wild was almost certainly a death sentence. A lone cub could not survive. But integrating him into another pride was equally impossible. Wild lions did not accept strange youngsters. They saw them as competition. There was one option, a sanctuary, a facility designed for lions that could not survive in the wild. But sanctuaries were far away. They required special transport. They required funding and paperwork and bureaucracy that seemed to move at a glacier's pace when a cub's life hung in the balance. Sarah made calls. She wrote emails. She contacted every conservation organization she knew. Days became weeks. The cub grew stronger physically, but emotionally he remained withdrawn. Then, 3 weeks into the cub's recovery, Elena came to Sarah with troubling news. "I've been monitoring him closely," Elena said. "His mother's death was likely caused by a rare parasitic infection. I've been running blood work to confirm what I suspect." "And?" Sarah asked, though she could see the answer in Elena's face. "The cub is infected too, the same parasite. It's in the early stages, but without treatment, he'll deteriorate within weeks." Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. They had saved his life once. Now they had to save it again. Elena began treatment immediately with medications that would attack the parasite without harming the young lion. But the medication was rare. It was expensive. It required daily monitoring. Sarah found herself advocating for this cub, with an intensity that surprised her. She wrote grant proposals, she contacted private donors, she gave interviews to media outlets. Slowly, resources materialized, not because the system was kind, but because Sarah refused to let this young animal die. The cub's condition stabilized, then gradually improved. Then, over the course of weeks, his strength returned. But the parasite treatment had left him with lasting damage. His immune system had been compromised. His growth had been affected. The veterinarians estimated that even if he survived to adulthood, he would never be large enough to compete as a wild lion, never be strong enough to hold territory, never be viable in the unforgiving ecosystem that had already rejected him. Sarah sat with the cub one evening, watching him eat from a bowl of meat that Elena had prepared. His eyes found hers, and in that moment she understood the heartbreaking reality. This cub would live. This cub would be cared for. This cub would never be alone again. But this cub would never be free. The sanctuary had finally confirmed that they had space for him. A wildlife reserve in Kenya with proper facilities and experienced staff. He would be transported next month. He would live there for the rest of his life in an enclosure that was large and naturalistic, but was ultimately an enclosure. Sarah had saved his life twice, but she could not give him back what he had lost: his family, his territory, his future as a wild animal. The day of transport came. The cub was sedated carefully and placed in a specialized transport crate. Sarah and Elena had prepared him as much as possible. His medical records were extensive, his dietary needs were documented, his behavioral patterns had been analyzed. As Sarah watched the crate being loaded onto the transport vehicle, she found herself thinking about the pride that had abandoned him, about the mother who had died while he was still nursing, about the simple, brutal mathematics of wildlife that had nearly killed him. But she was also thinking about his eyes, about the moment when he had first seen her on that rocky outcrop, alone and desperate, about the fact that he had survived. She pulled out her phone and recorded a video message for the sanctuary staff, detailing everything about this cub's care, his triggers, his preferences. She spoke for 20 minutes, pouring everything she had learned about him into words. When she finished, she sent the file. Then she did something she had learned to do only in her years of conservation work. She let go. 6 months later, Sarah received an email from the sanctuary in Kenya. The cub, now given the name Simba by the sanctuary staff, though Sarah thought that was cliché, was thriving. He had grown. His immune system had strengthened. He had bonded with a caretaker named David, a man who spent hours each day with him, maintaining the social connection that lions required. Simba would never hunt in the wild, never know the kill, never fight for territory under the African sky, but he would live, he would have companionship, he would know that he mattered to someone. Attached to the email was a video. Sarah clicked it hesitantly. Simba was now nearly 2 years old, substantially larger than when he had left. He moved with the grace inherent to lions, but with a gentleness that Sarah recognized. His eyes, still the same eyes that had looked at her with desperate hope on that rocky outcrop, were now calm and present. In the video, David was playing with him, and Simba was playing back. There was joy in his movements. There was vitality. Sarah watched the entire video without blinking, tears streaming down her face. She thought about the pride that had abandoned him. She thought about the mother who had died. She thought about the mother who had died. She thought about the parasite that had tried to kill him twice. She thought about the bureaucracy and paperwork and fundraising that had saved him. And she thought about what it meant to be a wild animal who could no longer live in the wild. Sarah sat at her desk and began to write. She wrote about the 3 days the cub had spent alone. She wrote about his mother's death. She wrote about the difficult choice to remove him from the wild forever. She wrote about the heartbreaking reality that sometimes saving a life meant changing it forever. When she finished, she gave the document a title, The Forgotten Prince. It was the story of a lion cub who had been abandoned by his pride. It was the story of humans trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. It was the story of survival that came at a cost. And it was the story of a young animal who had been given a life he never would have had, even if that life was not the one nature had intended. Sarah uploaded the documentary to her department's archive, then sent an email to her team. If you need me, I'll be reviewing wildlife rehabilitation protocols. We need to do better. This cub won't be the last one abandoned. Because that was the truth. In the wild, abandonment was not cruelty. It was survival. But understanding that didn't make it hurt less. Simba was alive. That had to be enough. That had to be everything.